The settlement papers were signed at 10:14 on a Tuesday morning in late October, in a law office on the second floor of a building in Ashford, Ohio, that smelled of carpet cleaner and old coffee. Evelyn Marsh was 69 years old. She sat across a conference table from the man she had been married to for 41 years and watched him sign his name in the places the attorney indicated without once looking up. Gerald did not look up because Gerald had already left the marriage in the way that men who have planned their exits carefully sometimes do, incrementally and without announcement, so that by the time the papers arrived, the actual person was already gone and what remained in the chair across the table was only the legal formality of him. She had one bag with her, a green canvas overnight bag that had belonged to her mother and that she had carried for 30 years because it was sturdy and because she had never understood the logic of replacing things that still worked. Inside it were 3 changes of clothing, her blood pressure medication, her reading glasses in a case she had mended with tape when the hinge broke 2 winters ago and had not gotten around to fixing, her mother's silver locket on its chain, a small spiral notebook, and $62 in cash. That was what remained of the last withdrawal she had made from the joint account before Gerald's attorney had gotten the freeze put in place. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. She had not been a grateful recipient of Gerald's financial success. She had run the administrative office of a manufacturing company in Ashford for 19 years, raised 2 sons, kept the household accounts for 4 decades, done the books for Gerald's landscaping side business for 11 years without pay, and spent the final decade of the marriage providing daily care for Gerald's mother, Norma, who had moved into the house on Calder Street in 2012 and died there in 2019 without once expressing gratitude for any of it. What Evelyn received in exchange for 41 years of that particular kind of labor was a settlement her attorney had called limited but not unusual for a case of this nature, which was the language attorneys used when they had done what was possible and needed to move to the next file. She walked out of the building at 10:31. The morning was cold in the settled way that October in Ohio is cold, past the point of argument. She stood on the sidewalk with her bag on her shoulder and looked at the parking lot where Gerald's car was no longer, because he had already driven away, which told her he had not considered the occasion worth waiting for. She had not expected him to wait. She had stopped expecting things from Gerald some years before the end, which was one of the reasons the end had surprised her less than it probably should have. The motel was 4 blocks from the law office. She had booked it for 3 nights because 3 nights was what the math allowed. Room 114 faced the parking lot and had a bedspread in a pattern designed to obscure its own history. She set her bag on the luggage rack, sat on the edge of the bed, and let the quiet of the room settle over her without fighting it. Her name before Gerald was Evelyn Ruth Calloway. She had grown up in Pratt's Mill, Ohio, a town of 4,000 people and 1 working stoplight, the only child of Robert and Helen Calloway. Her father had worked for the county highway department for 31 years. Her mother had kept the house and the garden and the accounts and the 200 daily decisions that constitute a household, and had done all of it with a matter-of-fact efficiency that Evelyn had absorbed so completely she had never thought to examine it until she was old enough to see it clearly. She had been a good student in the way of children who learn early that competence is reliable. She read whatever the school library had and a good deal more from the county library. She was strong in mathematics, a gift her father had noticed when she was 8 and encouraged in the steady, undemonstrative way that was his register for most things. She had thought, at 17, that she might study mathematics at the university in Columbus. She had the grades and the aptitude and the intention. Then her father died of a heart attack on a Sunday morning in March of her senior year, and the mathematics degree dissolved the way plans made by 17-year-olds do when the ground shifts without warning. She stayed in Pratt's Mill. She took a clerical job at the manufacturing company in Ashford, 30 minutes east, and she was good at it in the way she was good at most things she decided to take seriously, by paying attention and not making the same mistake twice. She met Gerald Marsh at a company picnic in the summer of 1981. He was 32 to her 25, a salesman for a plumbing supply company who had come along with a friend. He was tall and easy in a crowd, the kind of man who makes a gathering feel more settled simply by being present in it. He listened well in those first months, or appeared to, asking questions and staying with her answers in a way she had found, by 25, to be rarer than it deserved to be. They dated for 11 months. She was careful about it the way she was careful with most things that mattered, not pressing toward a conclusion before she had enough to trust it. By the end of the first year, she trusted it. They married in June of 1982 in the church in Pratt's Mill, where she had been confirmed, with her mother in the front pew. The early years were ordinary in the way that good marriages can be, full of the daily work of two people building a shared life from available materials. They bought a house in Ashford in 1984. Their son Daniel arrived in 1985 and Paul in 1988. She kept working. Gerald kept selling. She did the household accounts and later the books for the landscaping business Gerald started in 1991 with his brother Dale, who lasted 2 years before a disagreement over money ended the partnership. After that, Evelyn ran the books alone for a business that had never paid her for the work and that Gerald never thought to discuss compensating her for, because Gerald processed their finances as his domain and her contribution to them as support rather than labor, a distinction that would cost her considerably in the legal proceedings that followed 40 years later. Gerald was not a cruel man. She had returned to this conclusion many times in the 14 months since he had told her he was in love with someone else, and the conclusion held each time. He was not cruel. He was simply a man who had never stopped to ask whether the life Evelyn was living inside their marriage was the life she would have chosen if the choosing had been hers to do. His mother, Norma, moved into the house on Calder Street in the spring of 2012. Gerald framed it as a temporary arrangement, which was how it became permanent, because things framed as temporary are easy to accept and very hard to revisit once they have settled into the shape of ordinary life. Norma had held the opinion since the second year of the marriage that Evelyn was acceptable without being impressive, and she had maintained this position with consistency across 3 decades of holiday dinners and Sunday visits. Living with her in the house had required from Evelyn a sustained daily expenditure of patience that she managed without visible strain, because the alternative was a conflict that would not have resolved anything and would have made the house, which was already not entirely comfortable, very difficult indeed. Norma died in August of 2019. Evelyn cooked the food for the reception after the funeral and wrote the thank you notes and organized the distribution of Norma's belongings among Gerald's brothers and their families. And then, 14 months after Norma's death, Gerald sat her down in the living room and told her he had been seeing someone for 2.5 years. Her name was Christine. She was 54. She worked for one of Gerald's clients. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. Evelyn sat across from him in the living room of the house, where she had spent 36 years, and heard this with the particular quality of attention of someone receiving information that reorganizes everything around it. Gerald had been unhappy. He had been unhappy in ways she had been managing and accommodating for decades, and it had not previously occurred to him to mention that this unhappiness had been her problem to solve rather than a shared condition of their shared life. She did not say this. She told him quietly that she understood, which was true, and that she needed time, which was also true. Then she went upstairs to the small room off the master bedroom that had been her reading room for 20 years and sat and looked at the wall. The 18 months of legal proceedings had been handled by her attorney, Faye Doherty, a woman who was thorough and direct and who had done what was possible with limited material. The house had a mortgage worth more than its current assessed value. The joint savings were modest. Gerald's attorney had argued, with some success, that the landscaping business had been Gerald's venture, his risk, his creation, and that Evelyn's years of bookkeeping had been a marital contribution rather than compensable work. The pension from Gerald's employment was the largest recoverable asset, and the division of it was the one thing Faye had protected in full. But the pension payment was monthly and small, and it would not begin for 8 more months when Gerald turned 66. Until then, $62. A bus pass. 3 nights in a motel where the ice machine on the 2nd floor ran all night. She found the listing on the 3rd morning, on her phone, drinking the complimentary coffee from the lobby machine. She had been looking at rental listings in Ashford and the surrounding towns, running numbers she already knew were not going to work against the monthly figures she was finding. The listings were not encouraging. She scrolled past the observatory posting and then scrolled back. Something at the edge of her attention had caught on it without her fully intending to let it. It was filed under a county tax sale, a category she had not known existed until she clicked through it from the general property search. The description was terse in the way of county documents, which communicate the minimum required information with maximum efficiency. A parcel of 4 acres on Ridge Hill Road in Cutters Creek, Ohio, including one primary structure described as a 2-story observatory building, stone construction, built 1961, in need of significant repair. No utilities currently active. Property seized for unpaid taxes following death of last owner. Minimum bid at auction, $50. She looked at the 4 photographs attached to the listing. The building was round at the top and square at the bottom, the way small observatories were built in that era, with a dome that had gone green with weathering and a stone base that was dark gray and old but solid, she thought, in the way stone construction often remains solid long after anyone expects it to. The grounds were overtaken with goldenrod and wild grass. One upper window was boarded with plywood. The front door, visible in the last photograph, was heavy wood and closed. There was a name in the listing she read 3 times before she was certain she had read it correctly. Last owner, deceased, Arthur Raymond Calloway. Cutters Creek, Ohio. Died 2021. Her father's name had been Robert Calloway. Her maiden name was Calloway. Pratt's Mill was 11 miles from Cutters Creek. She set the phone on the nightstand and looked at the ceiling of room 114 for a long time. She had no way of knowing, in that motel room, whether Arthur Calloway had been any relation to her. The name was not common in that part of Ohio, but it was not so rare that coincidence was impossible either. Her father had been one of 3 brothers. She had lost contact with her Uncle Harold's branch of the family sometime in the early 90s, when distance and the small, ordinary frictions of extended family had done their slow work. It was possible. It was also possible the name meant nothing at all. But the name was there, and the auction was in 4 days. And the minimum bid was $50, and she had 62. She called the county property office the next morning at 9. The clerk she spoke to confirmed the minimum bid, the date, and the cashier's certified check requirement. Then Evelyn asked whether the county had any additional records on the property or the previous owner. The clerk put her on hold for 3 minutes and came back with what the file showed. Arthur R. Calloway had purchased the property in 1961, taxes had been paid without interruption through 2018, and the estate had been unable to satisfy the outstanding balance after the owner's death. No other owners on record. No liens beyond the tax debt. No encumbrances. She thanked the clerk. She sat with this information. Then she called her son Daniel that evening. He was 40, lived in Cincinnati, worked in insurance. He had the listening quality she recognized from her father rather than from Gerald, steady and without agenda. He heard everything she said, and when she finished he asked 2 questions. The first, did she think Arthur Calloway had been family? She said she didn't know. Possibly. The second, was she going? She thought about how to answer precisely. I have 4 days in this motel already paid for, she said, and nowhere clear to go after them. I have $62. I don't think the situation calls for waiting to feel certain. Daniel made the sound she recognized from childhood as the sound of someone deciding to trust rather than persuade. He offered to send money. She told him she knew he could, and she was not asking him to. He told her to call when she got there. She said she would. The bus to Cutters Creek left Ashford at 7:20. It was a county transit line that stopped at 6 towns on its route, depositing her in Cutters Creek at 9:40, 40 minutes before the auction's scheduled start. She sat in the second row with her bag on the seat beside her and watched the October landscape pass. Fields stripped to stubble, tree lines bare against a sky the color of old pewter, the flat interior of Ohio that she had spent her whole life inside, and that she had never found dramatic and also never found anything other than her own. The auction was held in the parking lot of the county property office on Route 11. For people total, including the county official running the proceedings and a man in a real estate company jacket who had the manner of someone present out of professional obligation rather than interest. When the bidding for Parcel 14B, Ridge Hill Road, opened at the $50 minimum, the real estate man did not raise his paddle. No one else moved. Evelyn raised her hand. She paid $52. She kept 10. She received a receipt and a key. The key was long and iron, old in the way of things made before simplicity became a liability. It sat in her palm with a weight that seemed to belong to something the $52 could not entirely account for. She asked the county official if anyone had been inside the property recently. He checked his clipboard. A county assessor in 2022, he said. Nothing on record since. She thanked him, walked inside the county office, and asked the desk clerk to call her a cab. The cab driver took Ridge Hill Road from the south, climbing out of Cutter's Creek's flat center into the slight elevation that gave the town its name. The goldenrod along the roadside had gone brown at the tips. The maples were bare. The oaks still held their leaves, dry and copper, in the stubborn way oaks hold past every other tree's release. The road turned to gravel at a rusted green sign that had shed half its lettering. The cab followed it for a quarter-mile and stopped at a field gate. Beyond the gate, a track through overgrown meadow grass led to the building. The dome rose above the goldenrod in the gray morning light. The stone base was dark and still. She paid the driver and asked him to return in 2 hours. She stood at the gate with the iron key in her hand. The morning was completely still. No wind at all. The sky had lightened from pewter to a pale, undecided gray. A crow called once from an oak at the field's edge and went quiet. The building stood at the end of the track with the composure of something that has been waiting a long time and has made its peace with waiting. She opened the gate. She walked the track through the dead meadow grass, which came past her knees and released seeds against her coat as she moved through it. Up close, the stone walls were more present than the photographs had suggested, and more real. The mortar between the stones had cracked in places and been repaired at some earlier point with a darker material that was now cracking in its own thin lines. The dome sat on a collar of rusted metal. The boarded window on the south side was plywood over what had been, from the intact edges, a large pane of glass. The front door was heavy wood banded with iron. The handle was worn smooth in the place where a hand had gripped it, day after day, for 60 years. She put the key in the lock. It turned with the resistance of a mechanism that had not been asked to move in some time, grinding slowly and then releasing with a sound that felt, in the stillness of that morning, very loud and very final. She put her hand on the worn handle and opened the door. The smell that came out was cedar and cold stone and the deep layered stillness of a space that had been sealed for years and had managed the time well. Not the smell of neglect. Something more like patience, like a room that had been waiting rather than being forgotten. She stood in the doorway for a moment before stepping fully inside. The way you pause at the threshold of something you do not yet understand but recognize, somehow, as important. The ground floor was one large circular room, following the curve of the stone walls. A wooden workbench ran along the south section of the wall, still holding tools laid out with the care of someone who returned things to their places as a matter of habit. Chisels and small planes and brushes and instruments she could not yet name. A wooden stool pushed in beneath the bench. On the bench's surface, arranged as though their owner had stepped outside for a moment rather than never returned, were the partial components of something she could not immediately identify. Thin pieces of curved glass and small metal fittings and a cloth laid flat that had been used to polish something and then set aside. Along the north section of the wall, shelves ran from floor to ceiling, full of books, most of them old and cloth-bound and pressed together in the manner of a collection built over decades with care. Between the books, objects she could not see clearly in the available light. Framed things, wooden boxes, instruments in leather cases. A wood stove stood in the center of the room, its pipe going up through the ceiling, a stack of dry firewood beside it. A single wooden chair angled toward the stove the way a chair angles when it has been used in that position so many times that returning to any other feels like an error. On the wall above the workbench, a photograph in a plain wooden frame. She crossed the room to look at it. The photograph showed a man of perhaps 60, standing in the meadow outside this building in what appeared to be high summer, the goldenrod behind him at full gold height, and the dome of the observatory visible above his right shoulder. He was not smiling for the camera the way people smile when they know they are being photographed. He was smiling the way people smile when they are standing in a place they love and someone happens to catch them at it. He had her father's eyes. She recognized them with the certainty that precedes thought, the way you know a voice in a crowded room before you have found the face it belongs to. The same eyes she had looked at across the kitchen table in Pratt's Mill every morning of her childhood. The same eyes that had looked at her report cards and her skinned knees and her graduation photograph and had looked, always, as though what they saw was worth looking at. She stood in front of the photograph in the cold, still room with the iron key in her hand and the smell of cedar and old stone around her. Then she noticed the stairs. They were on the far side of the room, narrow and wooden, rising along the curve of the wall toward the floor above, where the dome sat. At the top of the stairs, visible from where she stood, a door, and the door had a padlock on it. Heavy brass, old but solid, closed. She looked at the key in her hand, then at the padlock. She crossed the room and climbed the stairs. The wood creaked under her, but held, each step firm in the way of things built by someone who understood that the work would outlast them. At the top she stood before the padlock door and looked at the lock and then at the key. The key was iron. The lock was brass. They were not an obvious match. She tried it anyway. The key did not fit. She stood at the top of the stairs in the gray light coming through the boarded window and looked at the locked door and understood that whatever lay behind it, she was not getting there today. It had been locked by someone who wanted it to stay locked, which meant there was a reason, which meant the reason was worth finding. She went back down. She stood again before the photograph on the wall. Her father had died in March of 1978. He had been 48 years old. He had never mentioned a brother named Arthur. He had never mentioned anyone in Cutter's Creek. He had never, as far as she knew, mentioned an observatory 11 miles from the town where he had raised her. He had been a private man. He expressed himself through his work and through the quality of his attention when he was with the people he loved. He had not been a man who explained himself or offered information that had not been asked for. She sat down in the wooden chair beside the cold stove with the iron key in her hand and the photograph of the man with her father's eyes on the wall across from her. Outside, through the door she had left ajar, the October wind was beginning to move through the dead meadow grass. She was sitting in a room that might belong to her family. She had a locked door she could not open, holding a key that did not fit it. She had $10 left. She had nowhere to sleep tonight. She sat in the chair and let all of this be exactly as large as it was, without trying to reduce it to something manageable. Then, after a time, she got up. She looked around the room with the steady, practical attention she had always brought to situations that required assessment before action. The wood stove appeared functional. The firewood beside it was dry. The stone walls would hold heat once there was heat to hold. The tools on the workbench were real tools, kept by someone who understood their value. The books, the shelves, the objects in their cases she had not yet had time to examine. She pulled out her phone and called Daniel. "I'm inside," she said. He asked what it was like. She looked at the tools laid out on the workbench and the books on the shelves and the photograph of the man with her father's eyes and the stairs going up to a door she could not yet open. "It's going to take more than 2 hours," she said. The cab driver came back at the 2-hour mark as arranged. Evelyn met him at the gate and told him she would need a ride to wherever in Cutter's Creek a person could buy food and basic supplies. He took her without comment to the general store on the main road, a low building with a hand-painted sign and a parking lot of 6 spaces. He waited in the lot while she went inside. She bought what $62 minus $52 minus the cab fare allowed, which was not much, but was enough if she was careful about it. Canned soup, crackers, peanut butter, a box of wooden matches, 2 large jugs of water because she had no way of knowing yet whether the building had any water connection at all, a flashlight with batteries because the observatory had no electricity and the days were growing short, a bar of soap. She carried everything to the counter in 2 trips and paid with the last of what she had and put the change in her coat pocket and counted it as she walked back to the cab. $4.31. She asked the cab driver, whose name was Terrence, whether he knew anything about the property on Ridge Hill Road, the building with the dome. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror with the look of someone deciding how much of a question is really being asked. "The Calloway place," he said. "You knew him?" Terrence lifted one shoulder in the way of someone for whom knowing and not quite knowing occupy the same general territory. Knew of him. He came into town for supplies, same as anyone. Kept to himself. Some people thought he was strange. Other people thought he was just private. He paused. He was here a long time. She asked how long. 60 years, give or take. Came when the building was new, I think. Or near enough. He turned back onto Ridge Hill Road without being asked. "You bought it at the tax sale this morning." Word travels. In Cutter's Creek it does. He said this without apology, which she appreciated. "You planning to stay?" She looked out the window at the oaks still holding their copper leaves. "I'm going to find out what's there first," she said. "Then I'll decide." He nodded as though this was a reasonable answer, which it was. He helped her carry the supplies through the gate and up the track to the front door without being asked to. At the door, he set down the jugs and looked at the building with the considered expression of someone who has driven past a place many times without ever standing in front of it. Old Arthur kept this place up, he said. Right up until he couldn't anymore. He paused. There's a woman on Birch Street who knew him better than most. Margaret All. She runs the alteration shop across from the diner. If you're looking to know more about who he was. She thanked him. She paid what remained on the meter and he walked back down the track, and she listened to his car move down the gravel road until the sound of it was gone, and she was alone in the complete, specific silence of a property that belonged to her now and had not belonged to anyone else in any active sense for 3 years. She got the wood stove going on the third match. The chimney drew well once the fire took hold, which told her the flue had been maintained. She set one of the soup cans on the flat top of the stove the way she had seen her mother do it in the house in Pratt's Mill when the power went out in winter, because her mother had grown up in a house without reliable electricity and had retained the knowledge of how to manage without it in the easy, unself-conscious way of someone for whom it was simply a skill rather than a hardship. Evelyn had absorbed this too. She was finding, this afternoon, that she had absorbed more from her mother than she had recently been giving herself credit for. While the soup warmed, she used the flashlight to look more carefully at the shelves along the north wall. The books were organized in a system she could begin to read once she paid attention to it. The bottom 2 shelves held reference volumes, star atlases, optical physics, celestial mechanics. Several of the atlases were old enough that their star charts used notation systems she did not recognize and had to reason through from context. Above those, a collection of bound journals with dates written on the spines in black ink. The earliest was 1962. The most recent, 2018. 56 years of journals on one shelf, each one the same size, the same dark green cloth binding, the same careful black date on the spine. She counted them. 56. One for every year he had worked in this building. She did not open one yet. She was not ready to open one yet. She understood without being able to fully articulate why that the journals were the center of something, that they needed to be approached with the right kind of attention, which she did not yet have, because she was cold and tired and working on $4.31 and a long day that had not yet finished being long. On the top shelf, above the journals, in a row of small wooden boxes, each labeled in the same black ink, lenses. 12 boxes, some holding single lenses in padded compartments, some holding matched pairs. The labels specified diameter and focal length in the shorthand of someone who had worked with the same materials long enough that their notation had become its own language. She lifted the lid of the nearest box. Inside, nestled in a cloth lining, a lens about 4 inches across, ground to a surface so smooth it reflected the flashlight beam with a clarity that made her stop and look at it for a moment longer than she had intended. Whatever Arthur Raymond Calloway had been, he had been someone who knew how to make glass do what he wanted it to do. The soup was warm. She ate it from the can standing at the workbench, looking at the photograph on the wall, and thought about her father. Robert Calloway had been one of 3 brothers. She had known this in the general way that children know the basic facts of their parents' histories without having asked for them. Specifically, her father's older brother was named Harold. She had met Harold and his wife a handful of times at family gatherings when she was young, and had not retained much beyond the impression of a large, loud man who laughed at his own stories. She could not now recall the name of the 3rd brother. She had not known, or had not remembered, or had perhaps never been told. Her father had not spoken of his family in the detailed way that some people do, the way that makes the past feel populated and continuous. He had spoken of them the way private men speak of most things that touch them, obliquely and in passing. And she had been young enough when he died that she had not yet thought to ask the questions she would later understand she had. The man in the photograph on the wall was not Harold. Harold had been broad and fair and had always looked, even standing still, as though he was about to make a point. The man in the photograph was slight and dark-haired and carried himself with the particular self-sufficiency of someone who had spent most of his life in his own company and had found it sufficient. He looked like her father the way 2 people can look alike without looking similar, the resemblance operating at a level below features, something in the quality of the attention behind the eyes. If you're hooked on this story, Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She slept that first night in the wooden chair with her coat on, and the stove banked down to coals, and the flashlight on the floor beside her. She woke twice, once when the fire needed feeding and once when a sound from somewhere outside resolved itself into wind moving through the dome's metal collar in a low, intermittent tone she had not heard before, and that took a moment to place. Both times she got up, did what was needed, and went back to the chair. She had slept in worse conditions. She had managed harder nights. In the morning she walked the full perimeter of the building in the early gray light. The stone was solid everywhere she pressed her hand against it. The dome's collar was rusted, but the bolts holding it were intact. At the rear of the building, half buried in weeds, a hand pump over a stone basin, the same type as the one in the first inspiration story her mother's cabin in Vermont had used, though she did not know that. She worked the handle. Nothing came at first, and then, after 5 long strokes, water ran cold and clear into the basin and kept running as long as she kept working the handle. She stood in the October morning behind this stone building she had bought for $52 and pumped well water into a basin and felt something she could not name precisely, but that had in it the quality of usefulness, of being in a place where her effort produced a direct and visible result, which was not something she had felt in a long time. She went into Cutter's Creek that afternoon on foot, which took 40 minutes on the gravel road, and then the state route, and was cold but manageable. She found Birch Street without difficulty. The alterations shop had a sign in the window and a bell above the door that announced her arrival, and the woman behind the counter looked up from a hem she was pinning with the unhurried attention of someone who is accustomed to being interrupted and has no strong feelings about it either way. Margaret All was perhaps 75, with white hair cut short and the precise, economical movements of someone who has worked with her hands all her life and has not wasted emotion in decades. She looked at Evelyn for a moment after Evelyn introduced herself, and then she set down the fabric she was holding and said, "You bought the Calloway property." "This morning," Evelyn said. "Word travels," Margaret said, in the same tone Terence had used, which told Evelyn that this was a thing the people of Cutter's Creek had long since accepted about their town rather than felt any need to apologize for. She offered Evelyn a chair and a cup of coffee from a small machine on the counter that produced both quickly and without ceremony. Evelyn accepted both and sat down, and Margaret All sat on the stool she used while working and looked at her with the frank, assessing attention of a woman who had been measuring people for most of her life. "You said your father was Robert Calloway," Margaret said, after Evelyn had explained what she knew. "From Pratt's Mill." "He was." Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking at something in the middle distance that was not in the room. Arthur talked about his brothers. Not often. He was not a man who talked often about anything personal. But sometimes, when we were talking about families, he would mention them. She paused. "He mentioned Robert more than the other one. Harold, I think." "What did he say about him?" "That they had lost touch. That it had been a long time." Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "He said once that Robert had been the one he was closest to when they were boys, and that losing the connection with him was something he regretted but had not known how to repair. He said sometimes you wait for the right moment to fix a thing, and the moment doesn't come, and then the window closes." She looked at Evelyn directly. "I got the impression there had been some kind of falling out between Arthur and the family generally. He did not say what it was about." Evelyn held the coffee cup and thought about her father, who had also been a man who did not say what things were about. "How long did you know him?" she asked. 40 years, Margaret said. "He came in to have things mended. A man who lived alone and worked with his hands wore out his clothes in specific ways. He was a good customer. And eventually he was a friend, in the way of people who see each other regularly over many years and discover they are comfortable with each other's silences." She smiled slightly. "We were both people who preferred silences to small talk, which made the friendship easier." Evelyn asked about the work he had done. The lenses, the journals, the observatory. Margaret's expression changed in a small but visible way, the way it changes when someone is asked about a subject they consider worth explaining carefully. "Arthur Calloway had been," she said, "a self-taught optical craftsman of considerable skill. He had built the telescope in the dome from components he ground himself, starting in the early 1960s and refining across decades. He had published papers in small astronomical journals under his own name. He had corresponded with universities and with amateur astronomical societies across the country and in Europe. He had never sought formal recognition for any of it and had never received much, which had not appeared to trouble him. He had a gift, Margaret said, the kind that doesn't ask for an audience. He just wanted to do the work. Evelyn thought about this. She thought about the workbench with the tools laid out in order and the lens in the padded box and the 56 years of journals on the shelf. She asked about the room upstairs. The locked door. Margaret looked at her for a moment before answering. He locked that room in 2018, she said, when his health got bad enough that he knew he wouldn't be able to use it anymore. I asked him once what was in it. He said it was where he kept the things that mattered most. He said he had left a way for the right person to find it. She paused. I assumed that meant family. I assumed that meant someone would come. She looked at Evelyn steadily. I did not know who. Evelyn walked back to the observatory in the late afternoon. The oaks along Ridge Hill Road were losing their leaves now in the wind that had come up since morning, copper and dry, the sound of them on the gravel like something being counted. She walked with her hands in her coat pockets and thought about a man who had locked a room and left a way for the right person to find it, and about what that meant, and about the key she carried that fit the front door of a building but not the room inside it. She spent that evening going through the workbench drawers. There were 4 of them, each running the full width of the bench. The top 2 held tools organized by function, lapping compounds, and polishing materials and gauges of different sizes. The 3rd drawer held correspondence, neatly bundled and secured with rubber bands that had lost their elasticity and lay slack around the papers. She did not read the letters yet. She set them on the bench and kept looking. The 4th drawer was shallower than the others. Inside it were 3 things. The first was a small leather notebook, different from the green-bound journals on the shelf. This one had a soft cover and an elastic strap holding it closed, and it was worn in the way of something carried in a pocket for a long time. She opened it. Inside, in the same careful black ink as the journal spines and the lens boxes and everything else she had seen of Arthur Calloway's handwriting, were notes in a technical shorthand she could not fully decode, measurements and calculations, and small precise drawings of optical components. At the back, separated from the technical pages by a strip of cloth, 3 pages written in plain language. She read these slowly. He had known, he wrote, that the property would eventually pass to the county. He had no children. His brother's children were strangers to him at this point in his life, though he held none of them responsible for the distance between them. He had left the deed in the hands of the county because he had no one to leave it to directly, and because some part of him had believed, without being able to justify the belief in rational terms, that the property would find its way to the right hands through whatever mechanism things found their way when they were meant to. He had locked the upper room in 2018 and had kept the key separate from the building key specifically so that whoever came would have to stay long enough to find it, to prove by the finding that they intended to stay. The key to the upstairs room, he had written, was in the telescope itself. She looked at the stairs for a moment. Then she looked at the ceiling above her, where the dome sat on its rusted collar and where the telescope, which she had not yet seen, waited in the room she had not yet opened. She thought about what he had written. The key was in the telescope, but the telescope was in the locked room. The locked room she could not reach without the key. She went back to the notebook and read the 3 pages again, more slowly. On the 3rd page, in the last paragraph, he had written something she had skimmed past. He wrote that the door to the upper room had 2 locks. The padlock, which used a key he had left in the building, and the old mortise lock in the door itself, which was original to the building and used the same iron key as the front door. She had tried the iron key on the padlock. She had not tried it on the mortise lock below the padlock. She got up from the workbench. She picked up the flashlight. She climbed the stairs. At the top, she held the flashlight steady and looked at the door. The padlock hung from a hasp above the handle, closed in brass and immovable without its own key. Below it, set into the door in the older way of things built before padlocks became the standard method, the original lock with its iron plate and its keyhole below the handle. She put the iron key into the mortise lock. It turned without resistance, smooth and complete, 1 full rotation, and she heard the bolt withdraw. The padlock held the hasp, but the hasp itself was screwed into the door frame. The wood of the frame around the hasp screws had dried and shrunk across. 3 years of the room sitting sealed, and when she pushed against the door with both hands, firmly and steadily, it gave. The hasp plate pulled away from the frame with the sound of old screws releasing their grip on old wood, and the door opened. The air that came out was different from the air in the room below. Warmer, somehow, in spite of the cold, and carrying with it a different quality of stillness. Not the patience of the lower room. Something more concentrated, more intentional. She raised the flashlight. The upper room was round, following the curve of the dome, and at its center stood the telescope. It was larger than she had expected, a refractor mounted on a heavy equatorial mount, the tube long and pale in the flashlight beam, the mount itself a precision of gears and counterweights that must have taken years to complete. It was pointed at the dome's shutter, which was closed, as it had been closed since 2018, but the alignment of it was deliberate, the way you point something at a destination even when you cannot presently reach it. Around the room's curved wall, on shelves built to follow the arc, were things she could not yet take in all at once. She moved the flashlight slowly. Framed photographs. Dozens of them. Astronomical images, she understood after a moment. The kind made by attaching a camera to a telescope and holding the shutter open through long dark hours. Nebulae. Star clusters. The ringed form of Saturn caught with a clarity that told her this telescope had been made by hands that understood what they were doing at a level most people never reach. Galaxies. The faint spiral forms of them, photographed across years and arranged chronologically along the wall. And below the photographs, on the lowest shelf, a row of wooden boxes she recognized as the same type as the lens boxes downstairs. She crossed the room and opened the nearest one. Inside, letters, bound with the same slack rubber bands as the correspondence in the workbench drawer below, but older than those. Much older. The paper at the top of the first bundle was the color of old cream, and the ink was faded at the edges, and the handwriting on it was not Arthur Calloway's careful black print. It was a different hand. Looser, more slanted, the hand of someone writing quickly or writing often. She lifted the bundle and looked at the first letter. It was dated April 1961. It was addressed to Arthur. It began, as letters from that era and that particular corner of Ohio often began, without preamble, moving directly into the thing that needed saying. She read the first paragraph standing in the beam of the flashlight in the cold circular room with the telescope pointing at its closed shutter and the photographs of 50 years of dark sky arranged along the wall. Then she had to sit down. There was no chair in the room, so she sat on the floor with her back against the curved wall and the letter in both hands, and she read it again from the beginning. The letter was from her father. Robert Calloway, of Pratt's Mill, Ohio, had written to his brother Arthur in April of 1961, the month Arthur purchased this land and began building the observatory on it. And in the letter, he had said things Evelyn read once quickly and then read again slowly because the first reading had not been sufficient to absorb what was in them. He had said that he was sorry, that the argument they had had over the winter had been his fault more than Arthur's, and that he had known this for several months and had been too stubborn to say it outright, and that he was saying it now because Arthur was doing something brave and real and Robert did not want to be estranged from him while he was doing it. He said he had told Helen about Arthur. Finally, after years of keeping the family's distance as though it were a position he shared rather than one that had been imposed on him. He said Helen had told him he was being a fool. He said Helen was right. He wrote, "I know you think we cannot repair this. I am not certain we can either. But I want to try if you are willing. I want my daughter to know who her uncle is. She is 17 and she reads everything and she has her grandmother's eyes, and you would like her. I think she would like you." Evelyn sat on the floor of the room her father had written about her in 63 years ago, before she had ever met Gerald Marsh, before the house on Calder Street, before Daniel and Paul and 41 years and a conference table and $62. She sat in the building her father had wanted her to know, written about when she was 17, and had her grandmother's eyes and read everything. And she held the letter in both hands and let what it contained be as large as it needed to be. Her father had tried to repair the breach. He had reached out to his estranged brother in the spring of 1961 and asked to begin again. He had written about her. He had said he wanted her to know her uncle. And then he had died 17 years later at 48, on a Sunday morning in March, before she was old enough to have been told about any of it. She looked at the bundle of letters in the wooden box. There were many of them. Years of them. She could see from the dates visible on the top edges of the stacked envelopes. She had not yet read them. She did not know yet what had happened after April 1961, whether the breach had repaired, whether Robert and Arthur had found their way back to each other before her father died, whether Arthur had known she existed in any personal sense or only as the girl mentioned in a letter before everything fell silent. She did not know yet what was in the rest of those boxes on the shelf. She looked up at the photographs on the wall. 50 years of dark sky, exposed patiently through the lens of a telescope built by hand in a stone building on a ridge in Ohio by a man who had her father's eyes and had locked this room in 2018 and left away for the right person to find it. She thought about what Margaret All had said, that he had left away for the right person, that he had assumed it would be family, that he had not known who. He had written about her in 1961. He had described her to his brother with the specificity of someone who had been listening carefully to news of her from a distance. She reads everything. She has her grandmother's eyes. She was 69 years old. She was sitting on the floor of a room she had paid $52 to access with $4.31 left in her coat pocket. She had nowhere else to go tonight and no certainty about where she would go next week or next month. And she had a box of letters from her father to a brother she had never known existed, sitting in her hands in the beam of a flashlight, in a building that had been waiting on a ridge for 63 years. She sat for a long time without moving. Outside, through the dome's sealed shutter, the October dark was coming on. The first stars were appearing somewhere above the metal, though she could not see them. Arthur Calloway had spent 60 years in this room looking at them through a lens he made himself, and the looking had produced the photographs arranged carefully on the walls around her. 50 years of patient attention to the things that existed at a distance too great for anything but light to cross. She thought about distance. About the distance between Pratt's Mill and Cutter's Creek, 11 miles, which her father had never crossed in her lifetime. About the distance between 1961 and now. About the kind of distance that is not geographic at all, but that operates between people who love each other and cannot find the words or the courage or the right moment to close it before time does the closing for them. She thought about the locked door and the key that had been there all along in the building she had bought, and the second key waiting inside the telescope she could now reach, and about the particular kind of love that prepares for a future arrival without knowing who will come or when, that sets things in order and leaves a way in, and then waits. She put the bundle of letters carefully back in the wooden box. She set the box on the floor beside her. She looked at the telescope, its long pale tube pointing at the closed shutter and beyond it the November sky. Tomorrow she would go back into town. She would find a phone charger because hers was nearly dead. She would ask Margaret All whether she knew of anyone who might rent a room cheaply for a week, or whether the building's wood stove was considered legally sufficient for a person to winter in a property that had no running electricity. Questions she suspected would not have simple answers, but that needed to be asked because she was not leaving this building without knowing what was in the rest of those boxes. She was not leaving this building. She understood this with the same quality of certainty she had felt standing at the field gate that morning before she opened it, the certainty that arrives before the reasons do, that does not require the reasons in order to be real. She went back downstairs. She fed the stove. She sat in the wooden chair in the warm circle of the fire's light with the small leather notebook in her lap and read the 3 pages again, the part about leaving away for the right person, and thought about her father writing in the spring of 1961 that he wanted his daughter to know who her uncle was. He had wanted her to know. It had taken 63 years and a county tax sale and $52 and a bus from Ashford. But she was here. She read the letters over 3 days. She read them in order, beginning with April 1961, and moving through 30 years of correspondence that her father and her uncle had conducted in the careful, intermittent way of 2 men who were not natural letter writers, but who had found, after the breach was repaired, that letters were the form their relationship took, and that the form was enough. They wrote 3 or 4 times a year, about their work, about the seasons, about things they had read. Her father wrote about her mother Helen's garden and the county road project he was supervising, and, increasingly across the 1960s and into the 1970s, about Evelyn. Her grades, the books she was reading, the way she had, at 19, taught herself bookkeeping from a manual she found at the county library because she needed the skill and saw no reason to wait for someone to teach it to her. Arthur wrote back about the telescope taking shape, about grinding a 6-inch objective lens across 8 months of weekends until the surface was correct to within a fraction of a wavelength of light. About the first night he opened the dome shutter and looked through the finished instrument at Saturn, and what it was like to see a thing he had been working toward for 3 years resolve itself out of darkness into something real and ringed and astonishing. They were not dramatic letters. They were the letters of 2 private men who had found, late and with difficulty, that they still cared about each other's lives. The estrangement itself was addressed in the early letters obliquely and then more directly. It had begun over their father's will in the winter of 1960. Money and land and a decision their father had made that Arthur had felt was unjust and that Robert had initially defended because defending it was easier than admitting his father had been wrong. The argument had lasted through the winter and into the spring, and it had been Robert who had finally written to say he was sorry and that he had been wrong to defend what he knew had been indefensible. Arthur had written back within a week. The breach, which had felt permanent from the inside, had closed in the space of 2 letters. Her father had died in March of 1978. The last letter in the bundle from Robert Calloway was dated January of that year, 2 months before, and it was ordinary in the best sense of the word, full of the texture of a life in the middle of being lived. He mentioned a repair he was planning for the front porch. He mentioned that Evelyn had taken a job she was good at and that the man she was seeing seemed steady, though Robert reserved judgment on this point with the characteristic caution of a father who did not offer approval until he had sufficient grounds. He said the winter had been cold but manageable. He did not know it was the last letter. That was the quality of ordinary letters. They did not know what they were. Arthur's letters to Robert after January 1978 were not in the box because there had been no address to send them to. What was in the box, in the same careful rubber-banded bundles, were letters Arthur had written and not sent, dated from April 1978 through 2016, addressed to his brother at the Pratt's Mill address, and never mailed. He had kept writing. For 38 years he had kept writing to a man who was no longer there to receive the letters, because the writing was the form the relationship had taken, and he had not been willing to let the form go just because one side of it had gone silent. In these letters, Arthur had watched Evelyn's life from the distance of what Robert had told him and what he had been able to piece together from the occasional mention of the Calloway name in county records and the one obituary he had found in a Pratt's Mill paper in 1996 when Helen died. He knew she had married. He knew she had sons. He did not know their names. He wrote, in a letter from 2001, that he had thought about reaching out to her directly many times and had each time decided against it because he could not be certain she knew he existed, and arriving as a stranger into a woman's life claiming to be family was not something he was willing to do without knowing she was prepared to receive it. He had decided instead to prepare this building. He had spent the last years of his working life in the upper room, not at the telescope, but at the small table she had not noticed on her first walk through, writing a document he called simply an account. She found it in the 3rd box, bound in the same dark green cloth as the journals, running to 40 pages in his careful hand. It was the history of the Calloway family as Arthur knew it. Their grandfather's land in eastern Ohio, the farm that had been divided wrong in the 1960 will, the brother Gerald who had always been the loudest and had used that volume to claim more than his share. The years of Arthur's isolation, which he wrote about without self-pity and without assigning blame he was not certain was warranted. The years of the letters with Robert. The 38 years of unsent letters after. At the end of the account, in a section dated 2017, he had written what he wanted to say to the person who found this room. He wrote, "I do not know who you are. I know only that if you have found this room, you are family, because I built the finding of it to require patience and willingness. And those are qualities that travel in families whether or not the families know it. If you are Robert's daughter, which I have hoped for without allowing myself to count on it, then you should know that your father was the best man I knew and that losing 30 years with him to a dispute about money is the regret I have carried longest and most carefully. He wanted you to know me. I was not brave enough to make that happen while either of us was alive. This is my attempt to do it from here." Below that, a single additional line. He had written, "The telescope is yours. Everything in this room is yours. Do with it what seems right to you." It was built with patience, and I hope you will find that patience waiting in it still. She sat at the small table in the upper room with the document in her hands for a long time. The November light came through the dome's shutter in the thin lines that the metal allowed and lay in pale bars across the floor. The telescope stood at the center of the room, pointing upward toward the closed shutter, and beyond it everything Arthur Calloway had spent 60 years looking at. Daniel arrived on a Saturday, 3 weeks after she had taken up residence in the building. He drove 4 hours from Cincinnati with his truck loaded with things she had told him she did not need and that he had brought anyway, because he was his grandfather's grandson, and expressing care through logistics was the only language available to him. Insulated sleeping bag, a battery-powered lantern, a camp stove with 2 propane canisters, a box of food his wife had assembled with the thoroughness of someone packing for a considerably longer expedition than 3 weeks. He stood in the doorway of the lower room and looked around with the careful, unhurried attention she had always loved in him, taking in the workbench and the tools and the shelves and the stove, and then he looked at the photograph on the wall and was quiet for a moment. "That's Grandpa's eyes," he said. "Yes," she said. She showed him the upper room. She let him read the account and the last section and the final line. He read slowly, the way he did everything, and when he finished he set the document on the table and sat without speaking for a long enough time that she did not try to fill it. Then he said, "What are you going to do with the telescope?" She had been thinking about this for 3 weeks. She had contacted, through Margaret All, a professor of astronomy at the State University who drove up on a Wednesday and spent 2 hours in the upper room with the telescope and left with the expression of someone who has seen something they had not expected to see. He said the instrument was extraordinary. He said the optical quality of the lenses was measurably superior to commercial instruments of the same era. He said he knew 2 institutions that would consider it a significant acquisition and could discuss terms if she was interested in that direction. She told Daniel all of this. Then she told him what she had decided. The telescope would stay. She was going to open the dome shutter, which required work on the rusted collar mechanism but was structurally achievable. She had already spoken to a contractor in Cutter's Creek who had looked at the building and told her the stone structure was sound and the electrical connection could be restored for a reasonable sum. Margaret had connected her with a woman at the County Historical Society who was interested in Arthur's journals and photographs and had mentioned, carefully, the possibility of a small grant to support the preservation of amateur scientific records of the kind Arthur had kept for 56 years. It would not make her wealthy. None of this would make her wealthy. But the pension began in 5 months, and the grant, if it came through, would cover the electrical work and part of the roof repair, and the university professor had mentioned that the astronomy department sometimes arranged viewing nights at private observatories as educational outreach, which would bring people up the gravel road and onto this property in a way that felt, to her, like the right use of what Arthur had built here. The morning Gerald called, she was in the upper room cleaning the telescope tube with the same type of cloth she had found on the workbench below, the cloth Arthur had used, learning by feel what the work required. Gerald had heard from Paul, who had heard from Daniel, that she was living in a building on a ridge in Cutter's Creek without electricity. He called to tell her this was not sustainable and that he felt, given the circumstances of the settlement, a responsibility to make sure she was all right. She listened to him say this. She thought about the conference table and the $62 and the parking lot where his car had already been gone. She told him she was all right. She told him she was more than all right, which was true in a way she did not feel the need to elaborate on for Gerald's benefit. She told him she did not require his concern, which was also true, and that she appreciated the call, which was only partially true but was the version she chose because she was not interested in the conversation that the other version would have opened. Then she said goodbye and returned to what she had been doing, which was the work she had decided to do, in the place she had decided to do it. Paul came in December, driving up from Columbus on a Sunday with his daughter, who was 12 and had expressed, according to Paul, an interest in stars. Evelyn opened the dome shutter for the first time. The collar mechanism had been freed up the week before by the contractor. A slow process of penetrating oil and patience, and 2 afternoons of careful work. And when she cranked the handle, the shutter moved with a grinding reluctance, and then opened, and the December sky came into the room in a rectangle of dark blue that made Paul's daughter, whose name was Rosa, make a sound Evelyn recognized as the sound of a person seeing something for the first time that they will spend the rest of their Life being glad they saw. She showed Rosa how to look through the eyepiece. She showed her how to move the telescope on its mount, the slow, deliberate tracking that followed a star as the Earth turned under it. Rosa stayed at the eyepiece for 40 minutes without being prompted, asking questions in the direct, insatiable way of 12-year-olds who have found something that interests them entirely. Paul stood beside Evelyn at the room's curved wall and watched his daughter and did not say much, which was his way when something mattered to him. After a while he said, "She's been asking about science camps." "Then find her one," Evelyn said. He nodded. Then he looked at the photographs on the wall, all 50 years of them, and he said quietly, "He did all of this alone." "For most of it," she said. "He had his letters. He had Margaret. He had the work." She looked at the photographs too. The galaxies and the nebulae and the ringed form of Saturn that Arthur had photographed first in 1963 and returned to across 5 subsequent decades to watch the ring angle change as Saturn moved through its 29-year orbit. "Some people find that the work is enough," she said. "If the work is the right work." Rosa pulled away from the eyepiece and looked at her grandmother with the open, assessing gaze of a child who has just decided something. "Can I come back?" she asked. "Anytime you want," Evelyn said. She did not leave Cutter's Creek. She had known she would not leave from the moment she had sat on the floor of the upper room with her father's letter in her hands. But she had allowed herself to proceed as though the question were still open until the question answered itself, which it had. In the way questions answer themselves when the answer has been present all along and is simply waiting to be acknowledged. She walked the property on a morning in late January, the first snow of the season coming down in the particular slow way of light snow that falls as though it has time. No wind, just the steady, quiet descent of it through bare trees. The goldenrod stalks were white-capped and the meadow was smooth to a single pale surface, and the stone walls of the building were dark against it in the way of things that have weathered many winters and expect to weather more. She walked to the edge of the property where the land sloped and the ridge fell away and the valley below was hidden under cloud, and the snow came down through the gray air, and there was nothing to hear but the sound of it landing. She stood there for a long time. She thought about her father writing a letter in the spring of 1961 to say that he wanted his daughter to know who her uncle was. She thought about the 63 years between that letter and this morning and everything that had accumulated in that distance. The marriage and the sons, and the house on Calder Street, and the conference table, and the $62 and the bus from Ashford, and the field gate, and the iron key, and the photographs on the curved wall, and Rosa at the eyepiece asking if she could come back. She thought about the word Arthur had written in his account. Patience. It was built with patience, and I hope you will find that patience waiting in it still. She had found it. She was standing inside it. The snow came down. The stone building behind her held its ground on the ridge the way it had held it since 1961, through 60 winters and all the weather they had brought. Inside it, on the shelves, 38 years of unsent letters waited in their rubber bands. On the wall, 50 years of dark sky. In the center of the upper room, the telescope her uncle had built with his own hands pointed at the open shutter and everything beyond it. She turned and walked back through the snow toward the building that was hers now, past the pump and through the door, and into the warmth of the room where the stove was going and the tools were laid out on the bench, and the photograph of the man with her father's eyes looked out from the wall with the expression of someone standing in a place they love, caught in a moment of it, held there by the particular patience of an image that does not know how long it will wait before the right person comes to look at it. She had come. She was here. And for the first time in a very long time, here was exactly where she meant to be. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.